From 1998 to 2012, I produced a radio show and podcast called Changesurfer Radio. The show was eclectic, but its tagline was a sexy high-tech vision of a radically democratic future, and it helped shape the technoprogressive ideas that we've been nurturing at the IET. Many are still relevant today, and it's time to dust some off and share them again. Reading Walter Truett Anderson's book To Govern Evolution in graduate school was a revelation. He argued that Homo sapiens have been transforming natural ecosystems for 10,000 years, and that anticipating the anthropocene debate, it was time to take responsibility for governing the ecosystem. He also wrote Reality Isn't What It Used to Be, a field guide to the postmodern condition. I interviewed Anderson for Changesurfer Radio on September 9th, 1998. He went on to write The Next Enlightenment, which wove together Buddhist insights with the Western Enlightenment tradition into a single account of human evolution. His work combining democratic theory, evolutionary biology, and Buddhism is still generative for technoprogressives today. This is Dr. J with Changesurfer Radio. For the next half hour, keep your radio tuned to the left and your mind in the open position as we present a sexy high-tech vision of a radically democratic future. Speaking with Walter Truett Anderson, he's a political scientist, former Hollywood reporter for TV Guide, a psychotherapist, and author of many books and articles on many different topics. Syndicated columnist for the Pacific News Service. His articles can be read at www.pacificnews.org/JINN/, and author of most recently The Future of the Self from Tarcher Putnam. Welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Hi, glad to be here.
And so your most recent book is about how the concept of the self is changing under impacts of society. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Not only the concept of the self, as you might find it, for example, in cognitive science, but the experience of the self for a lot of people, for a lot of different reasons, because people move around a lot, because we're heavily into the information age in which a lot of people live a good portion of their lives in cyberspace and different kinds of chat groups with different identities and different names and different genders, which they seem to change with gay abandon, because drugs such as, for example, Prozac are being developed that have profound effects on people's self-concepts, because ancient Eastern spiritual traditions that question our Western modern concepts of the self are increasingly becoming part of mainstream Western culture. For these and any number of other reasons, many of which I've tried to touch on in the book, people are thinking differently about personal identity, about boundaries, about what it is we are and how consistently we are what we are, all those things that have to do with what you mean by self.
Now, a long time ago, actually 1980, I think, a fellow named Zurcher wrote a book. He had done studies of people, asking them what they were and had them write down 10 words. And he found a trend back in the 70s that people were beginning to shift away from being a butcher, baker, and candlestick maker to being the compassionate person or the person who likes chocolate, intrapsychic experiences that were more self-validatable than the...
That's very interesting. I didn't know about that at all.
Yeah. Do you think that's
kind of similar to a technique that I understand is employed in some spiritual schools where they just keep asking you, who are you, who are you, who are you, until you kind of run out of all the more glib answers.
And as things change more rapidly, you can't hold on to the things outside.
Right.
So what are some of the impacts that this postmodern selves that we will be creating will have on the 21st century?
Well, one of the most interesting, I think, that I talked about a bit in the end of the book when I constructed some scenarios of the future is a question of what will be the impact on political identity and how we organize ourselves in societies and think of ourselves as members of society. Now, for some people, identities such as race and ethnicity and nationality are absolutely all important, and if you look around the world today, you can see places in the former Yugoslavia, along the boundary between Israel and Palestine, any number of places where those identity issues are just absolutely overriding for people. But at the same time, you can look at a lot of places, and there's evidence all over that a lot of people in the world, for various reasons, sometimes deliberately and sometimes just in response to the conditions of life, are kind of letting go of a lot of those identities and finding they are not central to their being, that they, in some cases, extract very high prices that aren't really equal to what people get out of them. So you find a lot of people who don't take their national or racial identities all that seriously, and in many cases who absolutely refuse to be labeled by those.
So this makes possible the creation of a more cosmopolitan global identity, or?
Yeah, I think it's one of the commonplace observation of political scientists that the nation state has kind of passed its prime, that nation states are no longer have a monopoly on governance, that all kinds of other institutions, from corporations and non-governmental organizations and all kinds of things, are part of the system out there. And if that's happening in the world of government and politics, it's also happening to some extent in the world of psychology and identity. What I'm saying is that if nation states aren't as important politically as they once were, neither are they, for many people, as important as the primary definer of identity that they were only a fairly short while ago. You find a lot of people with dual passports and connections to 2 or 3 different places or countries or languages and cultures that are kind of more multiple people than the singular people that we used to assume everybody had to be.
3 books back, you wrote Reality Isn't What It Used to Be, the title of one of your books, and that was about the postmodern condition. Is this a consequence of the postmodern condition in the terms of ourselves?
Oh, sure. It's all a piece of it, and as a matter of fact, one of the reasons I turned to that subject of the self in this most recent book, The Future of the Self, was that theme pops up a lot if you explore the literature of postmodern philosophy and especially postmodern psychology. You find a lot of people coming up with new and rather, in some cases, unfamiliar or strange-sounding concepts about what we mean by selfhood. For example, one of the sources I have quoted quite a bit is psychologist Kenneth Gergen, who comes up with the concept of what he calls multifrenia, and he simply says that in the kinds of societies and social environments we live in today, kind of bombarded by messages from different cultures that come at us from the television and the news, and because we travel and because people from other places keep traveling through the places we live in, because of all this mobility and richness of information, that it's no longer possible to construct and maintain a coherent and more or less permanent sense of selfhood and identity the way somebody perhaps could have done in a simple tribal society or in a village where you interacted with the same people and the same ideas day after day after day and could always expect consistent feedback on who you are and what's going on and what's right and what's wrong and what's real. So we're in a much, you can say, a much richer environment. That's kind of the positive way of putting it. You could say a much more confusing environment. But whatever it is, that's kind of part of the diagnosis of life in the postmodern world that's being distilled by various thinkers, including some psychologists, into some propositions about what we mean by mental health in these days. What kind of a person do we need to learn how to be? Do we need to learn how to be integrated and authentic and consistent in the way that psychology of just a decade or so past assumed, or do we need to learn some other kind of psychological skills in order to survive and be decent, reliable people, realizing our capabilities in a much more complex kind of society.
So giant oaks versus willows.
Yeah, and these are issues. As we said when we started out, you can find them being expressed in very complex and abstract philosophical and theoretical terms in all kinds of different fields of exploration, but you can also find them just being lived out there in the streets and in the homes and the communities by all kinds of people who may or may not have had access to those kinds of ideas, but who find that they are the conditions of life in our time, put people in multiple communities instead of one, put people into contact with many cultures instead of one, and that the old rules just don't always apply. And so, as I say, these things aren't just intellectual playthings. They're real gut issues for a whole lot of pretty ordinary people who find that the conditions under which they go about saying who they are and what they think and what they do and what they belong to are changing, and that they have to learn some new skills in order to just kind of go ahead and live their everyday lives.
Now, you've also written about the relationship between democratic governance and ecology in Evolution Isn't What It Used to Be and To Govern Evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And you argued with the deep ecologists who believe that humanity should just get out of nature and stop messing around. And you argue persuasively, I think, that we have a responsibility to acknowledge and accept our management role in nature and to do that in as democratic a way as possible. How different is this? I wonder, where you find allies for this kind of view, because it seems like this is a view that's usually associated with conservatives, the kind of private property first libertarians who would deny any kind of ecological crisis.
Well, I think you'll find I've gotten a lot of feedback of all kinds over the years since I began propounding those ideas, and they have ranged all the way from people more or less regarding me as the Antichrist because I'm not I am not saying that we have to learn how to get our hands off nature, to people saying, oh, absolutely, this is what we're doing, this is what we're going to be doing. We have to learn how to, as Stuart Brand of the Whole Earth Catalog fame said years ago, if we are to be as gods, let's get good at it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a part of the difference. Is not a difference in many ways of values. I mean, I come out of many years in the environmental movement, and having written books and been very active in many ways around environmental issues. But over the years, I realized that in a world of how many people we got, 6 billion and counting upward, with very rapid technological change, that we are just not about to back away from involvement with nature and even control of nature. And so it pushed me to begin to think that we needed a different kind of a vision of what's happening, and a different kind of sense of ethic that includes some environmental responsibility, but at the same time recognizes that we are, in fact, in a highly populated world. And parenthetically, I wish it were a little less so, but it seems to me that our moral obligation is not to make pronouncements about what kind of a world it ought to be, but to take stock of what are the conditions out there, and then to think as creatively and responsibly as we possibly can about how we deal with those things.
You've also written most recently about, in some of your articles, about the new isolationism on the part of labor and the environmental movement and their reactions to the decline of national sovereignty under globalization. And you again argue that we should really embrace our global responsibility, the role of global governance, and that this isn't a conspiracy of the right or the left, but just something that's going to happen and we should get involved with it. But it seems like you take one step short of making the classic call of groups like the World Federalists for actual institutions of global governance. Is that something that you envision, that we will actually have a global government?
No, definitely not. And I had an interesting dialogue, it was a couple of years back at the World Future Society conference in Washington, where they put on a debate about global governance, and they had somebody from the Cato Institute essentially presenting a libertarian point of view, and they had a man who had written a book called When Corporations Rule the World, who was essentially taking a fairly alarmist position about the growing power of corporations, and we had a man from the World Federalists talking about the need for institutions of a kind of recognized constitutional sort. In other words, a real old world government. And I think that's kind of obsolete reasoning to think that we are going to impose a Philadelphia-style constitution and a capital and all those kinds of tools on a very rapidly changing multicultural global civilization. And so it seems to me that what's happening, instead of moving toward a world government, is move toward world global governance, which is a lot of things happening at a lot of different places. And I guess you could say that it's in some sense runs parallel to my image of what's happening to our individual personalities, which is that people move from being centralized and unitary toward being multi-centric or decentralized and multidimensional. And as far as I can see, the global governance system that's emerging in the world is all kinds of organizations. It's nation states are still there. It's intergovernmental organizations. It's non-governmental organizations, which have just grown like mad in recent years. All kinds of them, from little local groups to big global organizations that are present at those conferences in Cairo or Beijing or wherever, where people are talking about world issues. It is quite true that private businesses, private organizations, multinational, transnational corporations have their own kind of governance powers and governance functions. So there's all kinds of players out there, and it's just a different kind of a world from that sort of centralized, top-down, hierarchical kind of model of government that I'm afraid the World Federalists are still clinging to. I'm not opposed, by the way, to, and it seems to me that the part of what is happening is a move toward people creating more and more institutions, such as International Criminal Court, which is a very hot subject right now, that kind of look like institutions of world government. But if you look closely at what's happening there and at the concerns and the distribution of power, you can see that it's a much less clear and centralized kind of system that's emerging.
You've extended your argument about the need to embrace our democratic managerial responsibilities to the genome. You want to say a little bit about that? I mean, I think most people, when they hear the connection between politics and the genome, think state-sponsored eugenics. And how is your vision of that responsibility different from a eugenic one?
Well, I've argued here and there that eugenics is one of those words. I don't know. There's something that just happens to words once in a while that they kind of get locked into a particular meaning. It's the notion of a state guided program of selective breeding and all those kind of wacko ideas that eugenicists of a few decades ago were in fact proposing. And if you go back into the history of it, and you probably read some of the history of that I looked at in To Govern Evolution, you can find that the United States did at one time have a fair number of laws that were kind of de facto eugenics. I mean, laws against marriage between races in many states, laws that permitted the sterilization of people
retarded.
with retarded and various forms of mental illness, all those things which are in fact eugenics. So you can find a lot of places where those things exist. But part of what I try to remind people of is that there's all kinds of de facto eugenics that's going on in the world today as people get more information about genetics and make decisions on the basis of it. People routinely in the United States now get amniocentesis or one of those other tests that can identify the likelihood of giving birth to a child with a genetic defect, and make decisions on the basis of that. Now, those are not state-guided decisions; they're individual decisions, but they're still, in fact, eugenics. There are still, in fact, people using genetic information to move toward what they perceive as more desirable reproductive outcomes. And I talked a bit in the book "Evolution Isn't What It Used to Be" about a really remarkable example in the state of New York of an Orthodox Jewish community, which has an extensive eugenics program, which they're very happy with, in which all young people are required to get a genetic test, and the elders of the community make decisions about who marries whom on the basis of that. And who does not get to marry whom would be a couple, both of whom carry the genes for recessive genetic diseases such as Tay-Sachs, which is a horrible and incurable disease that children can be born with, which are common to people of the Ashkenazi Jewish descent. So that again is a program of eugenics that's being practiced by a community that everybody seems to be rather happy with, although that in fact is what it is eugenics. So part of what I'm trying to say is that there are all kinds of things going on around the world, and there are going to be more of them. I've just been reading in the paper just over this past week about the emergence of tests that enable people to essentially choose the sex of a child before birth and conception. So is that eugenics? Sure it is. I mean, more information about genetics is becoming available to more people, and as that information becomes available, people will make decisions on the basis of it. I don't see any place where it's being directed by a state government as we saw the beginnings of in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. I'm not saying that that's not possible, and I certainly would be opposed to it if I saw it emerging, because they would undoubtedly screw it up. But in fact, de facto eugenics is all over the place.
That seems to be a theme of your work, is for us to own up to the actual interventions that we're doing and then to take responsibility for them. Yeah,
there is an awful lot of desire to kind of make things go away, and think that you have dealt with them thereby, but then surprise, here they still are, And that's particularly true. I think we are in fact living in an information revolution, and there are all kinds of pieces of information and whole categories of information, such as, for example, biotechnology, that are just not subject to being destroyed. They are subject to all kinds of personal and social decisions, and that's what I think we need to do, is to address the personal and social decisions that are presented to us in a world in which biotechnology, for example, is moving increasingly into the center of agriculture, medicine, and various other fields, and not to think that we can somehow make it go away, because nobody is doing that or is about to do that.
Well, I can highly recommend your books, the three of them that I've read so far, and your articles online are always fascinating. And
thank you.
Again, they're available from www.pacificnews.org/JINN/. Do you want to say something about Pacific News? You're a regular columnist with them.
I guess I'm more of an irregular columnist with them. PNS, as we call it, Pacific News Service, was founded during the Vietnam War as a kind of alternative news service, and it tries very hard to be neither left nor right, but just sort of different, and it's more kind of a network of different people with different persuasions and interests and so forth than any coherent political movement or ideology. And I've been associated with it for I guess about 15 years now, and writing with a good deal of freedom on all kinds of subjects that catch my interest.
Well, great. It's been a pleasure having you.
Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate it too.
You've been listening to Changesurfer Radio. Changesurfer Radio is produced at WHUS-FM at the University of Connecticut in Storrs. If you want to learn more about radical democratic transhumanism, or you want to share your thoughts about this show with me, Dr. J, email me at jhughes, JHUGHES, @changesurfer.com. Also check out past and future shows and myriad relevant links at the website www.changesurfer.com.